What if I told you that the person you're married to never existed? And the scariest part is, you're the last one to know. This is the story of David Martinez, and by the end, you'll question everything you think you know about your own memories. The cobblestone streets of Charleston's French Quarter gleamed under the afternoon sun as David Martinez carried his bride Rebecca across the threshold of the historic Planters Inn. Their honeymoon suite overlooked the famous Rainbow Row, those pastel-colored Georgian houses that made Charleston a photographer's dream. David had chosen this place carefully. As an antique dealer specializing in Southern memorabilia, he knew the romantic power of history. Rebecca laughed as he set her down, her auburn hair catching the light streaming through the tall windows. "It's perfect, David. Just like our wedding photo is going to be when we frame it." Their vintage-style wedding photo sat propped on the mahogany dresser, still in its photographer's folder. They'd specifically requested the sepia-tone treatment to match David's collection of antique photographs back home in Savannah. In the image, they stood beneath the Spanish moss of Forsyth Park, Rebecca in her grandmother's restored 1940s wedding dress, David in his great-grandfather's military dress uniform. Everything looked exactly as it should, two people deeply in love, surrounded by the timeless beauty of the Old South. But as David unpacked their bags, he couldn't shake a strange feeling. Something about Rebecca seemed different today, more distant, as if she were studying him rather than celebrating with him. "Rebecca, do you remember what you said during our first dance?" David asked, hoping to recapture the magic of their wedding day just 48 hours ago. She paused, her back to him as she arranged her cosmetics on the antique vanity. "Of course, darling. I said I'd love you forever." But that wasn't right. She'd whispered something about how they'd finally found each other after all these years of searching. David felt a chill despite the humid Charleston air. Memory was everything to him. It's what made antiques valuable, what connected people to their past. So why couldn't he trust his own? The next morning, David woke to find Rebecca's side of the bed cold and empty. Panic shot through him as he called her name, checking the bathroom, the balcony, even the hallway. The hotel staff hadn't seen her leave. Her purse was still there, her phone charging on the nightstand, but Rebecca had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. David's hands shook as he called the Charleston Police Department, his voice breaking as he described his wife to Detective Sarah Chin. "She's 5'6", auburn hair, green eyes, wearing a blue sundress with tiny white flowers." As he waited for the police to arrive, David found himself staring at their wedding photo again. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His mother stood in the background near the fountain, wearing the same navy dress she'd been buried in 3 years ago. David's breath caught in his throat. His mother had died of cancer before he'd even met Rebecca. She couldn't possibly be in their wedding photo. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his phone and called his sister Maria in Atlanta. "Maria, was Mom at my wedding?" Silence stretched across the line before Maria's confused voice responded, "David, honey, Mom died 3 years ago." "And? David, you've never been married." The phone slipped from David's fingers, clattering on the hardwood floor. Detective Chen knocked at that exact moment, and David stumbled to answer, his world tilting dangerously. "Sir, we've checked with all the local hospitals, taxi companies, and rental car agencies. There's no record of anyone matching your wife's description. In fact..." Detective Chen consulted her notepad with a puzzled expression. "We can't find any record of a Rebecca Martinez checking into this hotel. The reservation is under your name only, and according to the front desk, you checked in alone yesterday afternoon." David's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the antique chair by the window. The wedding photo mocked him from across the room, his dead mother's image growing clearer by the moment. "That's impossible," he whispered. "We were just married. I have the photo, the memories, the..." But as he spoke, more inconsistencies flooded his mind. Rebecca never left any impression on the hotel staff. No one remembered seeing her at breakfast. Even the bellhop who'd helped with their bags seemed confused when David mentioned his wife. The terrifying truth began to creep in. Maybe he was losing his mind, Or maybe something far worse was happening in the shadows of Charleston's historic streets. David spent the next day obsessively examining every detail of their wedding photo while Detective Chen's investigation hit dead ends. No marriage license existed. No wedding venue had any record of their ceremony. Even the photographer David remembered hiring had no record of the shoot. But the photo remained stubbornly real in his hands, the paper aged and genuine, the sepia tones perfect. As the afternoon faded, David noticed another impossible detail. Standing behind Rebecca was a young girl with dark curls and sad eyes, maybe 8 years old, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow against the photograph's sepia background. That evening, David called Rebecca's childhood friend Lisa, whose number he found in Rebecca's phone contacts. "Lisa, do you remember Rebecca mentioning an imaginary friend when she was little? A young girl she used to play with?" Lisa's voice turned cold and strange. "David, I don't know who this is, but Rebecca Patterson died in a car accident 4 years ago. I was at her funeral. If this is some kind of sick joke." The line went dead, leaving David alone with the impossible truth staring back at him from the photograph. The little girl in the white dress seemed to be looking directly at him now, her eyes filled with an ancient sadness. Unable to sleep, David drove through Charleston's midnight streets to his antique shop back in Savannah, desperate to understand what was happening to him. His shop, Memories and More, specialized in authenticating historical photographs and documents. If anyone could solve this mystery, it would be him. Using his professional equipment, David examined the wedding photo under magnification and special lighting. The image was definitely real, not digitally manipulated, not a composite. But as he worked, more figures began appearing in the background. His college roommate who'd died in Iraq, his grandmother who'd passed away when he was 12, and most disturbing of all, a woman who looked exactly like Rebecca but wore modern clothes and stood apart from the wedding party, her face twisted in terror. The shop's grandfather clock chimed 3 a.m. when David finally admitted the truth that his rational mind had been fighting. This wasn't just a photograph. It was some kind of window into something impossible, something that was showing him people who shouldn't exist alongside people who couldn't exist. And at the center of it all was Rebecca, his wife, his love, his anchor to reality, who might never have been real at all. As David stared at the photo, the terrified Rebecca in modern clothes seemed to mouth a single word: run. David returned to Charleston the next morning with a desperate plan. If Rebecca was somehow manipulating their shared memories, there had to be evidence. Receipts, photos, anything that proved their relationship existed beyond his increasingly fractured mind. He systematically searched their hotel room, but every piece of evidence he found only deepened the mystery. Their supposed honeymoon reservations were made months ago, but David couldn't remember booking them. Love letters in Rebecca's handwriting filled his suitcase, but the ink looked fresh, as if they'd been written recently and aged artificially. The breakthrough came when David found Rebecca's appointment book hidden in her purse. Page after page detailed sessions with someone identified only as DM. David Martinez. The entries read like therapy notes, patient showing increased integration of false memories. Wedding fantasy now fully established. Recommend continued reinforcement. David's hands shook as he read entry after entry documenting how someone had been systematically building his fake marriage, layer by layer, memory by memory. The final entry, dated just 2 days ago, chilled him to the bone, patient becoming suspicious. May need to accelerate timeline for final revelation. That afternoon, David drove to the address listed in Rebecca's appointment book, a modest office building in Charleston's medical district. The brass nameplate read Dr. Rebecca Patterson, clinical psychologist. David's world collapsed completely as he stared at the name. This was the same Rebecca Patterson that Lisa had said died 4 years ago. With growing horror, David realized he'd been coming to this office for months, maybe years, but his mind had rewritten those therapy sessions as romantic dates, courtship, and eventually marriage. The receptionist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, looked at him with deep concern. "Mr. Martinez, you're not scheduled today. Dr. Patterson is, well, she's been dead for 4 years now. We've been very worried about you. Mrs. Henderson led David to a quiet corner of the waiting room and gently explained what she knew. "You've been coming here twice a week for 3 years, ever since your accident. You always ask for Dr. Patterson, and you always seem surprised when we tell you she's gone. The other doctors have tried to help you, but you refuse to see anyone else. You just sit in the parking lot for an hour, then leave." As she spoke, David felt his carefully constructed reality crumbling like an antique photograph exposed to too much light. The wedding photo in his jacket pocket seemed to burn against his chest, and he pulled it out to find that all the impossible people were now looking directly at him, their expressions mixing pity with terror. Dr. James Wright, the psychologist who'd been trying to treat David for 3 years, finally got his chance when Mrs. Henderson called him about David's breakdown in the waiting room. Dr. Wright was a patient man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he spoke to David with the gentle authority of someone who'd been waiting a long time for this conversation. "David, I need you to listen very carefully. 4 years ago, you were in a severe car accident. Rebecca Patterson was your psychologist before the accident. She was driving to an emergency session to help you through a crisis when her car was hit by a drunk driver." The words hit David like physical blows, each revelation shattering another piece of his false reality. "You blamed yourself for her death because you'd called her that night, begged her to meet you because you were having thoughts of self-harm. Your brain, damaged by the accident and overwhelmed by guilt, began creating an elaborate fantasy where Rebecca survived, where you two fell in love, where you could have the relationship you'd wished for instead of the tragedy that actually happened." Dr. Wright pulled out a thick file filled with real photographs, pictures of David alone at restaurants, alone at movies, alone in his antique shop talking animatedly to empty air. The truth was even more devastating than David could have imagined. His dissociative identity disorder had created Rebecca as a protective mechanism, allowing him to interact with the world without facing his guilt over her death. For 3 years, David had been having elaborate conversations with his own subconscious, creating memories of dates that were actually solitary walks, romantic dinners that were meals eaten alone while talking to his reflection. The wedding was the ultimate fantasy, his damaged mind's attempt to give himself the happy ending he felt he'd stolen from the real Rebecca Patterson. As Dr. Wright spoke, the wedding photo in David's hands began to change more rapidly. The false Rebecca faded away entirely, leaving only David standing alone in Forsyth Park, surrounded by the ghosts of people he'd lost. His mother, his grandmother, his college roommate, all the people his guilt-ridden mind had convinced him were somehow still present in his life. But now he could see them for what they really were, echoes of love and loss, projections of a mind too damaged to face reality. The little girl in the white dress was the last to fade, and as she disappeared, David finally recognized her. She was Rebecca Patterson as a child, the innocent victim of his selfish need for help that had led to her death. With Dr. Wright's help, David began to piece together the real story of Rebecca Patterson and the night that destroyed both their lives. Rebecca had been a dedicated therapist who specialized in trauma and dissociative disorders. She was only 28 years old, engaged to be married, with a bright future ahead of her. On the night of the accident, David had been struggling with severe depression following his mother's death and the failure of his antique business. He'd called Rebecca's emergency line at 11 p.m., threatening to harm himself if she didn't meet him immediately. Rebecca could have handled the crisis over the phone, should have, according to protocol. But she was compassionate to a fault, and she'd grown concerned about David's deteriorating mental state over their months of therapy sessions. Against her better judgment and her fiancé's protests, she drove through a thunderstorm to meet David at his shop. She never made it. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car at the intersection just 3 blocks away. She died instantly, while David waited in his shop, growing more agitated and angry that his therapist had abandoned him in his time of need. The real tragedy was that David's accident happened 3 hours later, as he drove home in a rage, convinced that Rebecca had broken her promise to help him. He'd been speeding through the same intersection where Rebecca had died when he lost control of his car and crashed into a tree. The head trauma had damaged his memory and sense of reality, but it had also spared him the immediate knowledge of what his crisis call had cost. His mind had rewritten the entire story, transforming Rebecca from victim to lover, tragedy to romance, guilt to joy. Dr. Wright showed David the real photographs from that night, police reports, hospital records, Rebecca's obituary with her fiancé's heartbroken testimony. "She was trying to save you, David. And in a way, she did. Your mind created the Rebecca you needed to survive, to heal, to find a reason to keep living. But now it's time to let her go and face the real work of healing." As David absorbed the truth, the wedding photo finally showed its real image, just David alone in Forsyth Park, holding a bouquet meant for a bride who had died trying to save him, surrounded by empty space where his fantasies had placed the people he'd lost. 6 months later, David stood in the real Forsyth Park, not as the delusional groom from his fantasy wedding, but as a man slowly learning to live with the truth. Dr. Wright's therapy had been painful but necessary, helping David understand that his elaborate Rebecca fantasy wasn't a sign of madness but of love, a damaged mind's desperate attempt to honor someone who had died trying to help him. The dissociative episodes were becoming less frequent, and David was learning to distinguish between his real memories and the false ones his trauma had created. David had made real changes in his life as part of his healing process. He'd turned his antique shop into a non-profit organization that provided free counseling resources for people in crisis, funded by the sale of his valuable collections. He'd also established the Rebecca Patterson Memorial Fund, which provided emergency mental health services to prevent the kind of tragedy that had taken her life. Most importantly, he'd learned to visit Rebecca's real grave, not the fantasy wedding venue his mind had created, to have honest conversations with her memory instead of elaborate delusions. The hardest part was forgiving himself for the night that changed everything. Dr. Wright helped him understand that Rebecca had made her own choice to help him, that her compassion wasn't David's fault even if her death was connected to his crisis. She was a healer, David. She died doing what she believed in, helping someone who was suffering. The best way to honor her memory isn't to marry her ghost, but to live the life she tried to save and help others the way she helped you. On this particular afternoon, David carried a single white rose to Rebecca's grave, the real one, in Magnolia Cemetery, where her fiancé still left flowers every week. David had met him, had apologized, had been forgiven in a conversation that felt more healing than any fantasy wedding ever could. As David placed the rose on Rebecca's headstone, he whispered, "Thank you for trying to save me. I'm finally ready to save myself." The wedding photo was gone now, burned in a ceremony that felt like both an ending and a beginning. In its place, David carried a real photograph of Rebecca from her memorial service, a reminder not of the fantasy love he'd created, but of the real person who had cared enough to drive through a storm to help a stranger in his darkest hour. David's story shows us how our minds can create elaborate realities to protect us from unbearable truths. But it also shows us that healing is possible when we're brave enough to face reality, no matter how painful. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please reach out for help. Real help, from real professionals, is always available. Like this video if David's journey resonated with you, subscribe for more psychological thrillers that explore the mysteries of the human mind, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you discovered your entire reality was a creation of your own wounded psyche? Remember, seeking help isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. Until next time, question everything, but never stop believing in the possibility of healing.